Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about our different Amazon machine image types, and specifically we're going to talk about the root device volumes. So these are the volumes in which you boot your operating system from. And there's two different types. There's EBS backed and then there's Instant Store backed. So just quickly we'll cover over what you can select your AMI based on. So you can select your AMI based on the region, based on the operating system, based on the architecture, so 32-bit or 64-bit, based on launch permissions, and then based on storage for the root device. So that's sometimes referred to as the root device volume. So you can either choose Instant Store, and this is referred to as ephemeral storage, or you can choose EBS-backed volumes. Okay, so here I am in the AWS console, and I'm just going to go over to EC2. And I'm going to just spin up a normal EC2 instance. So we've got our normal AMIs, and you'll see here it says root device type EBS, and it actually does this across all of them. And you'll also notice that most of your root device types are EBS on the default splash screen. So we're just going to go ahead and launch an Amazon Linux AMI, and I'm just going to go ahead and do all the standard settings. So just going to basically keep hitting next, and we'll call this EBS. And we're going to use my standard security group, which is my web DMZ, and go ahead and hit review and launch. And yes, we're not actually going to log into this instance. So there we go, it's now launching, and we're going to go back, and now I'm going to launch another instance. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to go to community AMIs, and you'll see here this is what we were talking about earlier in the first slide. So we've got operating systems, we've got architectures, and then we've got root device types. So I'm going to launch an Instant Store, and I'm going to do a 64-bit, and I'm going to use HVM virtualization. So I'm going to select this one here. And you'll see straight away the number or the instance families that I can launch this in is quite restricted. So I can't even get a T2 micro. So I'm going to go for an M3 medium and go ahead and hit next. And I'm just going to keep everything the same, hit next. Now with storage, if you read this really carefully, it says your instance will be launched with the following storage device settings. You can attach additional Instant Store volumes to your instance. You can also attach additional EBS volumes after launching an instance, but not Instant Store volumes. So I can attach one more Instant Store volume if I so wished, but I can't do that after this EC2 instance has been launched. So I can't attach additional Instant Store volumes. I can only attach additional EBS volumes. So I'm going to attach an additional one just for the fun of it. It doesn't give me many options. I can't even encrypt this Instant Store volume, despite it not being the EBS root device volume, despite it not being the root device volume. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and we're going to call this Instant Store. Go next, and we will use the same we'll use the same security group, launch wizard, and hit review and launch. I'm going to go ahead and hit review and launch, and I acknowledge. So now we've got two instances. One is using EBS, and the other one is using our Instant Store. I'm just going to pause the video here while this loads. Okay, so both my instances are now live. So with EBS, I can click on this, and I can go in, and I can, I can click on actions, and I can, with my instant state, just stop the instance and go ahead and stop it. I can then, because this is our root device volume, I could take a snapshot from this EBS instance in its stop state, and that's essentially what happens when you take a snapshot anyway. Even if you don't stop the instance, Amazon themselves will stop the instance. Now with the Instant Store volume, however, if I go to Actions and go to my instance state, you'll see I cannot stop it. I can reboot it, but I cannot stop it. I can only basically reboot or terminate. So that's a critical difference between Instant Store and EBS volumes, is that with an Instant Store, you cannot stop the instance. With EBS, you can stop the instance. Now, you might be thinking, well, why would I want to stop the instance apart from maybe taking a snapshot? Sometimes you get scenarios, and this really comes up in the SysOps exam, but we can talk a little bit about it here. We can actually see the health of our instance if we go up to here and go to our status check. And of course, because we've stopped the instance, we're not going to see this health status checks just yet. But this basically reports on the status or the health status of the hypervisors. Now, if the underlying hypervisor is in a degraded or failed state, what you can do is stop the instance and then start it again, and it will re-provision on a new hypervisor. So you can move the virtual machine around in the AWS data center by stopping and starting your EC2 instances. You can't do that with an instance store. So if you had an EC2 instance that is instance store based and it is on a failed host, that's it, you've lost that instance. So for that reason, it's called ephemeral storage, and it basically just means that you get less durability than if you were to use EBS-backed volumes. And EBS-backed volumes actually came out after Instant Store. So it used to be everything on EC2 was Instant Store based, and Amazon was, sort of heavily criticized by it at the time because if you had any kind of host failure underneath, you'd lose your virtual machine. So there wasn't a lot of data persistence. Another thing I can go and do is if we go down to our volumes, and you can see here, this is my volume that's in use and was just created. And essentially, I can go in and detach this volume. So I can detach it from that EC2 instance and potentially attach it to another one, even though it's the root device volume. Now, you'll notice that you can't do that with the Instant Store volumes because it's not even here. It's not even an option. So that is another difference. Okay, so to summarize, EBS versus Instant Store. So all AMIs are categorized as either backed by Amazon EBS or backed by Instant Store. For EBS volumes, the root device for an instance launched from the AMI is an Amazon EBS volume created from an Amazon EBS snapshot. For Instant Store volumes, the root device for an instance launched from an AMI is an Instant Store volume created from a template stored in S3. And for that reason, it can actually take a bit more time to provision an Instant Store volume than it does to provision an EBS volume or an AMI backed by EBS. So if you need to have very fast provisioning times, you would always use an AMI that's backed by EBS. You wouldn't want Instant Store volumes. Okay, so my exam tips. Well, Instant Store volumes are sometimes called ephemeral storage. Instant Store volumes cannot be stopped. If the underlying host fails, you will lose your data. EBS-backed instances can be stopped, and you will not lose the data on this instance if it is stopped. You can reboot both and you're not going to lose your data. And by default, both root volumes will be deleted on termination. However, with EBS volumes, you can tell AWS to keep the root device volume if you were to terminate your instance. And that's that check box that we saw in one of the last labs. Okay, so that's it for this lecture, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.